A billionaire CEO discussing his failed marriage and therapy is interrupted when a little boy bursts in. "Mom, stop listening to him complain and ask him out already." The therapist, mortified, hushes him out. Carl Stevenson sat stiffly on the leather couch, one arm draped over the back as if he were here by choice, rather than under pressure from his company's board. Therapy was a waste of time, but he was here to keep investors happy. A CEO going through a messy divorce wasn't a great look, and the PR fallout had been relentless. The media had torn his personal life apart, painting Vanessa as the poor, neglected wife and him as the cold-hearted billionaire who had driven her away. He didn't care about their opinions, but he cared about the stock prices. That was the only reason he was here, enduring Dr. Amanda Bennett's unrelenting gaze as she waited for him to say something meaningful. She sat across from him, her notepad balanced on her knee, the perfect picture of professionalism. She wasn't the first therapist the board had sent him to, but she was the first who didn't seem impressed or intimidated by his presence. It irritated him, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she always had a counterpoint to his statements, or how she refused to let him dodge questions. She wanted answers, wanted him to actually examine his role in the failure of his marriage, and he hated that. Vanessa had left, taken what she wanted, and moved on. So had he. What was there to talk about? Still, the silence stretched between them, and he knew she was waiting him out. She was annoyingly patient, never rushing him, but always watching, always listening. He exhaled sharply and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers threading together, as he finally gave her something. "You want to know why my marriage didn't work?" He didn't wait for her to respond. "Because it was never a marriage. It was a business arrangement that outlived its usefulness." She didn't react the way people usually did when he spoke so bluntly. No raised eyebrows, no disapproving frown, no immediate attempt to correct him. She just tilted her head slightly, considering him. "And yet you stayed married for 6 years. He shrugged. "It was convenient." Amanda tapped her pen against the notepad. "For who?" He was about to answer when the office door burst open. The sudden noise made him flinch before he could stop himself, but any irritation at the interruption was instantly replaced by confusion as a small, curly-haired boy stormed into the room, hands on his hips, wearing the determined look of someone about to make an announcement. "Mom, stop listening to him complain and ask him out already." Carl blinked. Amanda froze. The kid, who had to be no more than 7, looked between them expectantly, as if he had just solved a long-standing issue neither of them had been aware of. "Johnny!" Amanda shot up from her chair so quickly that she nearly knocked over her notepad. She moved to steer the boy out of the room, but he stood his ground, unfazed by the horror on his mother's face. "I'm serious," Johnny insisted, folding his arms. "You always say you like smart guys and he's rich, so that's a bonus, right? And he obviously needs help, because look at him." Carl, still processing, let out an incredulous laugh before he could stop himself. "Excuse me?" Johnny turned to him with a pointed nod. "You look like someone who doesn't eat enough cookies. Mom makes the best ones. You'd like them." Amanda managed to get a firm grip on his shoulders, gently but forcefully guiding him toward the door. "That's enough matchmaking for one day. Go wait in my office." Johnny groaned but relented, only pausing in the doorway to toss over his shoulder. "I'm just saying you should think about it." The door clicked shut behind him. The room went silent. Carl leaned back, studying Amanda, who stood frozen, pressing her fingers to her temple as if willing herself to disappear. After a long beat, he exhaled slowly, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, that's a first." Amanda turned sharply. "I am so sorry. He's usually not like this." "That's hard to believe." He smirked, stretching his legs out in front of him. "He's got confidence." "I respect that." She sighed, rubbing her forehead. "I swear, he must have overheard me talking to a friend or something. He's never done this before." "Shame," Carl mused. "If he started charging for his services, he could probably make a fortune." Amanda shot him a warning look. Do not encourage him. He shrugged, still amused. I mean, he's got a point. You do listen to me complain a lot. She folded her arms, composing herself. It's literally my job. He considered her for a moment, then, with deliberate ease, tilted his head. Now that he's mentioned it, though. What do you say, Dr. Bennett? Amanda blinked, caught completely off guard. What? You heard me. He stretched, making himself comfortable again, watching her squirm just enough to be entertaining. Johnny seems to think we'd be a good match. That is completely inappropriate. Is it? He looked entirely too pleased with himself now. Or is it fate? She let out an exasperated breath. It's definitely not fate. Then what is it? A ridiculous situation that will never be spoken of again, she declared, gathering her notepad from where it had fallen onto the floor during the chaos. Carl wasn't deterred. You sure? Johnny looked pretty convinced. Amanda shot him a glare that could have melted steel. The session is over. He stood, smoothing out his jacket. That's a shame. I was actually starting to enjoy it. She opened the door for him, clearly ready to usher him out before he could say anything else. But he paused in the doorway, glancing back with an easy smirk. See you next week, Dr. Bennett. Unless, of course, you want to take Johnny's advice and get dinner instead. Her look was answer enough. He chuckled and walked out, leaving her standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. She shook her head and exhaled, muttering under her breath before finally turning back to her office, where Johnny sat on her chair, swinging his legs. So, he said casually, grinning. How'd it go? Amanda leveled him with a stare. You, young man, are grounded. Johnny didn't even look remotely sorry. Worth it. Amanda closed the door behind Carl, pressing her back against it for a moment, willing herself to regain some composure. Johnny sat comfortably in her chair, still swinging his legs like he hadn't just stormed into a session and turned her professional reputation into a joke. Are you serious? She asked, rubbing her temples. Johnny grinned, completely unrepentant. What? He liked it. And you didn't exactly say no. Amanda let out a slow breath, crossing the room to kneel in front of him. Listen to me, Johnny. I am a professional. Carl Stevenson is my patient. That means I cannot, under any circumstances, ask him out. Johnny considered this for a moment, then tilted his head. So, if he wasn't your patient, then you could... She groaned, standing up and pointing to the door. Go. Homework. Now. Johnny slid off the chair, still smirking. You're welcome, by the way. Amanda watched him leave, then collapsed into her chair, staring at the ceiling. Carl Stevenson was already insufferable. Now he had ammunition. She would never hear the end of it. And she was right. At their next session, Carl walked in with 2 cups of hot chocolate, setting one on her desk before she could object. He took his usual seat, stretching out in that way that somehow made him seem completely in control of the room, and watched her reaction with far too much amusement. She folded her arms. What is this? Hot chocolate. Extra marshmallows. For me? For Johnny. Amanda inhaled slowly through her nose. That is wildly inappropriate. Carl shrugged. He's an investor in our progress. I thought I'd thank him for his contributions. She wasn't sure what was worse, that he had done it to push her buttons, or that Johnny would absolutely love it. She picked up the cup and set it aside, refusing to acknowledge it. If you think this is going to make me forget about last session, you're wrong. Which part? Carl asked, leaning forward. The part where your son called me out. Or the part where you didn't answer my question? Amanda's grip tightened around her pen. The part where my patient crossed a line. He smirked. And yet you haven't fired me. She exhaled slowly. Carl, we're not doing this. Doing what? Whatever game you're playing. His gaze flickered with something unreadable, just for a second, before he leaned back again. No games, Dr. Bennett. I'm here for my mandatory emotional evaluation, remember? She chose not to engage, flipping open her notepad. Then let's evaluate. To her surprise, he actually participated this time. He still had a way of deflecting with humor, but there was something more deliberate about his responses. He admitted things he hadn't before, that his marriage had never been built on real affection, that he had spent years prioritizing work over his wife, that he hadn't even noticed when things had started falling apart. What did she say when she left? Amanda asked, keeping her voice neutral. Carl exhaled, rubbing his jaw. She said I was never really there. That I wouldn't know how to love someone even if I wanted to. Amanda studied him carefully. Do you think she was right? Something flickered in his expression, but he masked it quickly. I think she deserved someone who could prove her wrong. That wasn't me. She wasn't sure if that was an honest answer or just another way of dodging the truth, but it was something. He had barely scratched the surface, but he was starting to let her see beneath the carefully cultivated image of Carl Stevenson, the untouchable billionaire. And she hated to admit it, but she found that version of him interesting. That, however, did not mean she was going to entertain his constant teasing. Unfortunately, Johnny had no such boundaries. It started small. Amanda suspected he had set his sights on matchmaking the second he saw Carl bring him hot chocolate, but he was smart enough to ease into it. First, it was casual comments at home. Carl's kinda funny, don't you think? Or completely unsubtle suggestions. You should probably start dating again. Maybe someone tall, with dark hair, and a business empire. Then came the more direct attempts. One morning, Johnny claimed he had sprained his ankle in the kitchen. Amanda, concerned, crouched to check it, only for Johnny to dramatically throw himself onto the floor, groaning in exaggerated pain. Mom, I can't walk. You'll have to call Carl to carry you, me, to the car. She gave him a long look. He peeked one eye open. Too much? She flicked him lightly on the arm. Go to school. That weekend, he arranged an entire candlelit dinner in their living room, complete with a tablecloth, a playlist of soft jazz, and an audience of stuffed animals. He had already set 2 places when Amanda walked in and froze. Absolutely not. Johnny, sitting at the table, rested his chin on his hands. Come on. It's good practice. For what? When Carl finally asks you out. She grabbed the plates, stacking them unceremoniously. You are impossible. Johnny groaned, dropping his forehead onto the table. You don't even try to make my job easy. She pinched the bridge of her nose. Johnny, you do not have a job. Says you. His persistence should have been annoying, but it was mostly ridiculous. And if it had just been him, it would have been easy to ignore. But Carl was enjoying every second of it. He had the audacity to act completely oblivious, even after Johnny orchestrated 3 separate, accidental, run-ins. The first was at Amanda's favorite coffee shop, where Johnny had dragged her one Saturday morning, only to feign utter shock when Carl strolled in minutes later. Wow, what are the chances? Johnny said far too loud. Carl raised an eyebrow. Almost like someone planned it. Johnny gasped. You think? That would be so crazy. Amanda, half awake, pointed at him. Sit down. Carl bought Johnny a pastry. Amanda vowed to ground him for a month. The second was at the grocery store. Johnny conveniently forgot which aisle Amanda had sent him to and instead returned with Carl in tow, looking smug. And the third, the worst one, was when Johnny invited Carl to a school event without telling her. Amanda had shown up expecting a normal parent-teacher evening, only to find Carl standing next to Johnny, holding a program. She marched straight to her son, lowering her voice. Johnny! What is happening? Johnny, grinning, rocked back on his heels. I told Carl you were coming. He said he had nothing better to do. She turned to Carl. You actually came? He smirked. What can I say? I had nothing better to do. She wanted to strangle them both. Carl, of course, found all of this incredibly entertaining. And the worst part? Amanda was starting to enjoy it too. Amanda tried to ignore how much Carl had integrated himself into her life. She told herself it was just Johnny's doing, that if her son weren't so determined to play matchmaker, Carl wouldn't be lingering at the edges of her daily routine. But the problem was that Carl didn't seem to mind. If anything, he encouraged it. Every time she thought she had drawn a clear boundary, he found a way to dance right on the edge of it, amused by her frustration, pushing just enough to make her react but never enough to cross the line outright. At their next session, he leaned back in his chair, looking far too comfortable, his usual smirk in place. "You know, at this point, I feel like Johnny is my unofficial life coach." Amanda, already exasperated, sighed. "You are not supposed to be engaging with my 7-year-old like he's your business consultant." "Why not? He's got good instincts." Carl shrugged, stretching his arms out as if he had nowhere else to be. "And to be fair, he's been more successful at getting me to reflect on my personal life than you have." She shot him a dry look. "Are you suggesting I should let a second grader run your therapy sessions?" He considered that for a moment. "Might be worth a trial run." She shook her head and flipped open her notepad. Pass. But he was right, he had been opening up more, though she wasn't sure if that was because of Johnny's interference, or because Carl was finally willing to let his guard down. That day, he surprised her by steering the conversation towards something real, something unguarded. "You keep pressing me about Vanessa," he said, his tone unusually thoughtful. "But the truth is, it wasn't really about her. I don't think I ever knew how to be a husband. My parents were never exactly role models." Amanda stilled, watching him carefully. He rarely talked about his past. In all their sessions, he had always kept things focused on his failed marriage, his public image, the logistics of his personal life rather than the emotional weight of it. But this was different. This wasn't about Vanessa at all. She kept her voice neutral. "What were they like?" Carl let out a slow breath, fingers tapping against the armrest. "They weren't cruel or anything. Just detached. Business first, emotion second, if at all. My father ran his company like a kingdom, and my mother was expected to fit into that world. I learned early on that being vulnerable wasn't useful. It didn't get you anywhere. It just made you easier to manipulate." Amanda studied him for a long moment. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His expression was unreadable, but there was something tight in the way he held himself, something almost distant, like he had trained himself to talk about these things without actually feeling them. She wanted to press further, but she knew better than to push too hard. Instead, she nodded slightly, keeping her voice steady. "That's a lot to unlearn." He glanced at her, something flickering across his face before it was gone. "Yeah. Turns out, some people don't want to wait around for that." Amanda wasn't sure if he meant Vanessa or himself. Maybe both. Maybe either. Either way, it stuck with her long after their session ended. But of course, she wasn't allowed to dwell on it for long, because Johnny was still very much on a mission. She should have known better than to have a phone conversation about Carl within earshot of her son. She had barely finished telling her friend over the phone that she had turned down a dinner invitation when Johnny, who had been quietly coloring at the table, suddenly perked up. "You said no?" he asked, horrified. Amanda sighed, lowering her phone. "You were eavesdropping." Johnny ignored that. "Why would you say no? I worked hard for that." She crossed her arms. "You do not get credit for my love life. But you never go on dates. That is not your business. It is if you're making bad choices." Amanda rubbed her temples. "Go do something productive." Johnny huffed but didn't argue. That should have been her first clue that something was coming. A few days later, Amanda was at a charity gala, the kind of event she usually avoided but had agreed to attend for the sake of the clinic. She had expected an evening of polite conversation, networking, and small talk. What she had not expected was to walk into the ballroom and see Carl Stevenson standing near the bar, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking like he had just stepped out of a magazine spread. She froze. Johnny, standing next to her, grinned triumphantly. "You're welcome." Amanda turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What did you do?" He rocked back on his heels. "Nothing, really. I just might have mentioned to Carl that you were coming tonight. And that you looked really nice in navy blue." Before she could respond, Carl had already spotted them. He made his way over, hands in his pockets, completely at ease. Well, fancy seeing you here." Amanda forced a tight smile. "I assume this is a coincidence." Carl looked far too amused. "If that helps you sleep at night." Johnny, eager to escalate the situation, immediately grabbed a glass of punch from the table and turned back to Amanda with a gleam in his eyes that made her stomach drop. "Hey, Mom!" It was too late. Before she could react, the punch sloshed forward, splattering against her dress in a mess of sticky red liquid. Johnny gasped, all false innocence. "Oh no! What a tragedy! If only someone had a jacket you could wear." Amanda closed her eyes for a long second. When she opened them again, Carl was already shrugging off his tuxedo jacket, clearly enjoying this far too much. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. "Wouldn't want you catching cold." Amanda clenched her jaw but didn't argue. The warmth of the jacket, the weight of it around her shoulders, sent a strange shiver down her spine. She caught the way Carl looked at her, something unreadable flickering there before he covered it with that signature smirk. But before she could say anything, before she could even fully process what was happening, a voice from behind made her entire body stiffen. "Amanda?" She turned slowly, the familiarity of the voice sinking into her bones. Daniel. Her ex-husband stood a few feet away, dressed in a suit, his expression caught between surprise and something sharper. His gaze flickered between Amanda and Carl, taking in the jacket, the closeness, the moment. Carl, who had no idea who Daniel was, simply raised an eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" Amanda exhaled, already feeling the headache forming. Johnny, still standing between them, leaned toward Carl and whispered loudly, "That's my dad. This is gonna be awkward." Daniel's gaze flickered between Amanda and Carl, lingering just long enough on the jacket draped over her shoulders to make his meaning clear. He wasn't surprised to see her at an event like this. Charity work had always been her thing, but Carl? That was new. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit with practiced ease, the same effortless charm that had once drawn Amanda and now carrying an edge of smugness. "Well," he said, tilting his head slightly, "I wasn't expecting to see you here. And certainly not like this." Amanda took a slow breath, bracing herself. "I could say the same. I'm in town for a few weeks. Thought I'd make an appearance." His attention shifted back to Carl, eyes sharp with interest. "And you are?" Before Amanda could intervene, Carl extended a hand, his expression unreadable. "Carl Stevenson." Daniel didn't shake it immediately. Instead, he let the name settle, recognition flashing across his face. "Right. The billionaire." A short pause. "The one who doesn't believe in love." Carl's fingers twitched slightly before he withdrew his hand, slipping it casually into his pocket. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's what the tabloids say. But you know how unreliable they can be." Daniel chuckled, crossing his arms. "Sure. But from what I hear, they weren't wrong about the divorce." Amanda felt Carl tense beside her, though he didn't rise to the bait. She stepped forward before this turned into some kind of silent battle of egos. "We should go," she said, keeping her tone even. Daniel lifted his hands in mock surrender. "Of course. Wouldn't want to interrupt. Whatever this is." "It's nothing," she said quickly. Too quickly. Carl exhaled sharply through his nose, his expression flickering for just a moment before returning to that carefully composed mask. He took a step back, adjusting his cufflinks. "Right. Nothing. Good to meet you, Daniel." Without another word, he turned and walked away, blending back into the crowd as if the moment had never happened. Amanda's stomach twisted, but she pushed it down. Daniel smirked. Didn't seem like nothing. Amanda leveled him with a look. I don't have time for this. She found Johnny waiting near the dessert table, looking far too pleased with himself despite what had just unfolded. He eyed her suspiciously. Where's Carl? He left. Johnny frowned. Because of Dad? Amanda sighed. It's complicated. Johnny crossed his arms. No, it's not. You like him. Johnny, I see the way you act around him. And how he looks at you when you're not paying attention. And don't even try to tell me that was nothing back there. Amanda rubbed her forehead, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Carl is my patient. Johnny groaned. So what? He's a person too. And he actually listens to you. She pinched the bridge of her nose. We're not having this conversation right now. Why not? Because it's not that simple. Johnny stared at her for a long moment, then, in a much softer voice, said, Maybe it was before. But he's trying, isn't he? She hesitated, the words settling uncomfortably in her chest. That night, after putting Johnny to bed, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular, still replaying the look on Carl's face when she had dismissed their relationship as nothing. She had seen him deflect, had watched him use humor to keep people at a distance. But this was the first time she had seen something else, something that looked an awful lot like frustration. And if she was being honest with herself, she didn't like the way it made her feel. She was still lost in thought when her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it was. Carl. Stevenson coffee. No therapy talk. No patient-doctor rules. Just coffee. She stared at the message for longer than she should have. Bennett, why? Stevenson, because I want to. And I think you do too, whether you admit it or not. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Bennett, I can't. There was a long pause. Stevenson, won't or can't? Amanda let out a breath and typed back before she could overthink it. Bennett, both. She put the phone down, running a hand over her face, but the moment she did, Johnny peeked his head into the room, clearly having read the entire exchange over her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a very slow, very deliberate nod, as if telling her she had just made the worst decision of her life. The next day, she found herself staring at her phone again, debating whether she should say something. But before she could, a new message popped up. Stevenson, I'll be at Lincoln's Cafe at 6. If you change your mind. She shouldn't have even considered it. But at 5:45, she was standing in front of her closet, annoyed with herself for putting in effort. At 5:55, she was driving, telling herself she was only going to see if he actually showed up. At 6:03, she stepped inside the cafe, her stomach tightening when she spotted him sitting at a corner table, nursing a cup of black coffee. She could still leave. Or she could sit down. Carl glanced up at her, eyes flickering with something unreadable before he gestured toward the empty chair. Amanda exhaled slowly. Then she sat. Either of them spoke for a moment. The air between them felt different than usual, something unspoken stretching between them, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge just yet. Carl finally broke the silence. Took you long enough. Amanda shook her head, suppressing a small smile. Don't push your luck. Carl leaned back, smirking. Wouldn't dream of it. But she knew better. And, to her surprise, she didn't mind. Amanda hadn't planned on staying long. She had told herself this was just to satisfy her curiosity, to prove that whatever this thing was between her and Carl didn't extend beyond playful banter and the meddling of a 7-year-old. But 20 minutes in, she realized how wrong she had been. The conversation started light. They talked about the cafe itself, how Amanda had been coming here since she was in college, how Carl only drank black coffee because anything else felt like a distraction. She called him ridiculous for that. He smirked and told her he thrived on efficiency. It was easy, effortless in a way she hadn't expected. But somewhere between the first and second cup, the conversation shifted. Carl ran a hand along the rim of his cup, his usual confidence giving way to something quieter. I never really saw the point of Christmas growing up. Amanda blinked, caught off guard. Not even as a kid? He shook his head. My parents weren't the festive type. Christmas was just another business quarter, another obligation. We had parties, sure, but they weren't about family. They were about connections, investments, keeping up appearances. I don't think I ever got a real Christmas until I was old enough to move out. Amanda tried to picture that. A childhood without twinkling lights, without the warmth of baking cookies in the kitchen, without presents picked out with actual care. She had grown up with homemade gifts, with her mom's slightly off-key caroling, with early morning excitement and wrapping paper everywhere. It was hard to imagine anything else. So, what did you do? She asked. He shrugged. Worked. That's what I do best. She watched him carefully. He said it like it didn't matter, like it had never mattered. But something about the way he said it, about the way he avoided her gaze, told her it did. Amanda hesitated before speaking. Johnny loves Christmas. He starts counting down in October. He makes a list, but not for presents, for activities. Hot chocolate nights, decorating the tree, movie marathons. It's his favorite time of year. Carl's lips twitched. Sounds exhausting. She smiled. It's a lot. But it's nice. Something flickered in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. And you? She frowned. What about me? What does Christmas mean to you? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. She could have said it was about Johnny, that it was about making things special for him, about keeping traditions alive. But as she sat there, staring at the steam curling from her cup, she found herself saying something else. It used to mean safety, she admitted, fingers tightening slightly around the mug. When I was married, it was the only time Danielle actually made an effort. The rest of the year, things were strained. But Christmas? He showed up. He smiled. He played the part. And for a while, I let myself believe that meant something. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That sounds lonely. It was. She let out a slow breath. It was. For the first time since she had met him, there was no teasing, no amusement, no carefully placed smirks. Just silence. And somehow, that said more than anything else. The moment stretched between them, neither one of them willing to break it, until finally, Carl leaned back and cleared his throat. So, Johnny's school is doing a fundraiser, right? Amanda blinked at the sudden change in topic. Yeah, why? I'll help. She raised an eyebrow. You? He exhaled, already regretting his decision. Yes, me. But if anyone asks, I'm just here for the snacks. A laugh bubbled out of her before she could stop it. She shook her head. This is a terrible idea. Probably. He picked up his coffee. But I'm still doing it. She should have said no. She should have reminded him that they weren't supposed to be doing things like this, that they weren't friends, that he was her patient and this was a bad idea. But instead, she found herself nodding. And that was how Carl Stevenson ended up at a school fundraiser, standing in the middle of a gymnasium filled with parents, surrounded by tables covered in baked goods and handmade crafts. He looked completely out of place, but to his credit, he didn't complain. Johnny, of course, was thrilled. You have to work the game booth, he insisted, practically dragging Carl across the gym. It's the most important job. Carl gave Amanda a look. Your son is very pushy. She smiled. He gets it from his mother. Johnny led him to a table lined with small baskets filled with bean bags. The goal was to toss them into a row of buckets, each with different point values. Carl stared at it. This is the most important job? Johnny nodded seriously. Obviously. Amanda watched as Carl, The same man who once told her he didn't have time for distractions spent the next hour coaching kids on how to throw bean bags into plastic buckets. And he was surprisingly good at it. He kept score with the seriousness of a stock market analyst, handed out prizes with just enough flair to make the kids laugh, and even cracked a joke about investing in better bucket technology. At one point, Amanda walked past just as a little girl high-fived him. "If anyone asks," Carl said, catching her expression, "I'm still just here for the snacks." She rolled her eyes. But she was smiling. For a moment, it felt like something was shifting. And then his phone rang. Amanda saw it happen in real time. The second he glanced at the screen, something changed. The ease in his posture vanished, his features tightening as he read whatever message had come through. He muttered something under his breath and stepped away from the table, answering the call in a low voice. Johnny frowned, glancing at Amanda. She already knew what was happening. Carl returned a minute later, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I have to go." Amanda nodded, trying to ignore the small, inexplicable pang of disappointment. "Of course." Johnny, however, was less understanding. "Now?" Carl glanced at him, something flickering in his expression before he schooled it back into indifference. "Yeah, kid." "Now." Johnny crossed his arms. "But we were winning," Carl exhaled. "You'll have to win without me." The words weren't meant to mean anything. But somehow they did. Amanda watched as Carl turned and walked toward the exit, his phone already in his hand, slipping effortlessly back into the life he had built for himself. The life where work came first, where emotions were secondary, where everything else was just noise. And just like that, the moment was gone. 3 days passed, and Amanda told herself she wasn't waiting for a message. Carl had made his choice. He had walked away from that school fundraiser without a second thought, answering a call that had apparently mattered more than anything else in that moment. She reminded herself that this was exactly why she had been hesitant in the first place. It wasn't personal. It never was with him. That didn't stop her from checking her phone more often than she wanted to admit. Not that she was expecting anything, Carl wasn't the type to explain himself. But there was a part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, that thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe he would send a short message. "Busy. We'll explain later." Or even something as simple as, "Sorry for leaving like that." But there was nothing. By the 4th day, she had pushed it out of her mind. She had work, she had Johnny, she had no reason to be thinking about a man who had made it clear where his priorities lay. It wasn't until that evening, when she was making dinner and Johnny was at the kitchen table doodling on a napkin, that her phone rang. She barely glanced at the screen before answering, expecting a call from a patient. Instead, a woman's voice filled the line. "Dr. Bennett?" Amanda frowned, recognizing it but unable to place it right away. "Yes?" "It's Naomi, Carl Stevenson's assistant." The name hit her like a slap. The slight edge in the woman's tone set her on immediate alert. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. "He's been in an accident." Everything else in the room faded. Naomi explained the details quickly. Carl had fallen asleep at the wheel after working nearly 36 hours straight. His car had veered off the road. It wasn't life-threatening, but he was in the hospital, unconscious from a mild concussion, with a broken arm and a handful of other injuries that would take weeks to fully heal. Amanda barely remembered responding. She was already grabbing her coat before Naomi had finished speaking. Johnny, seeing the look on her face, stood up immediately. "What happened?" She hesitated for half a second, then decided there was no point in hiding it. "Carl's in the hospital." Johnny's face paled. "Is he okay?" "He will be," she said, though the words felt flimsy. "Come on." They drove in silence. Amanda's hands were tight on the wheel, her breath short, her mind racing. It didn't make sense, this reaction, this deep, twisting feeling in her stomach. Carl wasn't hers to worry about. He was just a patient, just someone Johnny had taken a liking to, just a man who had walked into her life and made things more complicated than they had any right to be. And yet when she stepped into that hospital room and saw him lying there, looking far too still, everything else faded into the background. Naomi was there, arms crossed tightly as she spoke with the doctor, but she turned when she spotted Amanda and Johnny. They said he should wake up soon. The concussion isn't too severe, but he needs rest. Amanda barely heard her. She walked over to the side of the bed, her eyes scanning over the cast on his arm, the faint bruising along his temple. He looked different like this. Vulnerable. Like the man beneath all the sharp edges had finally been exposed. Johnny, still standing in the doorway, spoke up in a small voice. "It's cause of work, isn't it?" Naomi nodded tiredly. "He hasn't slept properly in days. I tried to get him to go home, but you know how he is." Amanda did know. And for the first time, she hated it. She sat down in the chair beside the bed, inhaling deeply, steadying herself. It didn't matter how frustrated she was with him. He was here. He was breathing. That was what mattered. And then, just as she was about to tell Johnny to sit down, Carl shifted. It was subtle at first, the twitch of his fingers, the slight furrow of his brow, but then his eyelids fluttered, and a low groan escaped him. His head turned slightly toward her, and then his gaze focused, hazy but aware. Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Carl blinked, still groggy. "Did you rush here because you secretly like me?" Johnny snorted from the doorway. Amanda, on the other hand, narrowed her eyes and squeezed his uninjured arm, firm enough to send a message. "You almost died. Maybe read the room." Carl exhaled, smirking just a little. "Didn't almost die. Just a little car crash." Amanda wanted to shake him. But instead, she exhaled slowly, resting her hands in her lap, keeping herself calm. "You're an idiot." "Probably." His gaze flickered past her, landing on Johnny, who had made his way closer. "Hey, kid." Johnny crossed his arms, looking unimpressed. "I liked you better before you were dumb enough to crash your car." Carl gave a small chuckle, wincing slightly. "Harsh." Johnny hesitated for a beat, then climbed up onto the edge of the bed, careful of the four. He studied Carl for a long moment, then said, "So, does this mean we're spending Christmas together?" Carl, still half dazed, let his head tilt slightly toward Amanda. "If it gets me out of work, then sure, kid." Amanda shook her head. "You need rest, not company." Carl hummed like he wasn't convinced. But his gaze lingered on her, something softer beneath the usual amusement. She didn't like how it made her feel, how it pressed against something inside her that she had spent years keeping closed off. Johnny, apparently satisfied, gave a firm nod. "Okay. But you owe me hot chocolate." Carl sighed dramatically. "Fine. But only if there's extra marshmallows." Johnny gave him a thumbs up. Amanda watched the two of them, something warm settling in her chest despite everything. She knew better than to let herself get attached to people who weren't meant to stay. But as she sat there, watching Johnny lean against Carl like this was the most natural thing in the world, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Carl was discharged with strict instructions to rest, though Amanda doubted he'd actually listen. The man seemed incapable of sitting still for more than 5 minutes unless it was in a boardroom where he could make everyone else nervous. He had grumbled through the process of getting dressed, insisted he was fine to drive himself home, despite his arm being in a cast and his movements still sluggish from the painkillers, and rolled his eyes at the mention of needing someone to check in on him. Amanda had stood there, arms crossed, watching him dig his heels in, and made the decision before she even realized it. "You're coming with me." Carl blinked. "What?" "Johnny's already expecting you for Christmas, and I don't trust you to actually rest if I send you home alone." She raised an eyebrow. "Unless you'd rather spend Christmas Eve in your penthouse, staring at your inbox." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Amanda smirked. "Thought so." And that was how Carl Stevenson, Billionaire CEO, found himself in Amanda Bennett's living room, wearing a too big sweater Johnny had insisted he borrow and being force-fed sugar cookies. Johnny was ecstatic, bouncing around with more energy than should be legal, directing Carl like a tiny foreman as they finished decorating the tree. "You have to put the star on top," Johnny declared, shoving the glitter-covered decoration into Carl's free hand. "It's tradition." Carl eyed the tree. "Not sure if you've noticed, kid, but I've only got one working arm." Amanda, from her spot on the couch, sipped her hot chocolate. "Don't worry, Johnny. I'm sure Carl will figure it out." Carl shot her a look, but Johnny nodded sagely. "Yeah. You're a CEO. You solve problems." "Unbelievable," Carl muttered, but he knelt down anyway, letting Johnny scramble onto his back to reach the top of the tree. It was awkward and completely ridiculous, and when the star was finally in place, Johnny let out a triumphant cheer. Amanda shook her head. "This might be the most undignified thing you've ever done." Carl smirked, standing up as Johnny clung to his good shoulder. "Not even close." They settled in after that, the three of them stretched across the couch in front of the fireplace. The room smelled like pine and cinnamon, the lights from the Christmas tree casting a warm glow. Amanda hadn't realized how much she'd missed this kind of holiday, the kind where nothing was extravagant or carefully planned, where things just unfolded naturally, filled with quiet moments and unexpected warmth. Johnny, halfway through a cookie, started nodding off against Carl's arm. Amanda watched them, something deep in her chest tightening. She hadn't expected any of this. Not the way Johnny had taken to Carl so quickly, not the way Carl, who had once scoffed at the idea of family traditions, had fit so easily into their little world. And certainly not the way she had started to look forward to seeing him, to hearing his voice, to knowing he was just a text or phone call away. She exhaled slowly. "This is different for you, isn't it?" she said softly, not really expecting an answer. Carl glanced at her. "What is?" "Christmas. Family. The whole thing." He didn't speak right away. His good hand rested lightly against Johnny's back, almost absent-mindedly. When he finally did answer, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I didn't think I wanted it." Amanda set her mug down, watching him carefully. Carl looked at the fire, his expression unreadable. "I spent years telling myself I didn't need this kind of thing. That it was all unnecessary. A distraction. I convinced myself I was better off without it." He let out a breath, almost like a laugh. "Turns out I was wrong." Amanda's fingers curled around the edge of the couch. "That's not easy to admit." He turned toward her then, something shifting in his expression. "No. It's not." The words hung between them, unspoken meaning filling the silence. Amanda swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. She had been so careful, so sure that keeping her distance was the right thing to do. But sitting here, watching the way Carl's fingers curled slightly around the fabric of Johnny's shirt as he slept, seeing the way he looked at her, not with amusement or flirtation, but with something deeper, something real, she knew there was no more pretending. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. Carl didn't look away. "Of what?" She let out a slow breath. "Letting someone in again. And then losing them." For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, "I've never wanted anything more than this." Her heart skipped. She could have brushed it off. Could have laughed, could have turned it into another one of their games. But she didn't want to. So instead, she leaned in. Carl didn't move, didn't so much as breathe as she closed the space between them. The kiss was slow, careful, like either of them wanted to break whatever had been building between them for so long. His fingers curled gently against her arm, pulling her just a little closer, deepening the moment just enough to make her pulse stutter. And then, "Took you guys long enough." Amanda pulled back just in time to see Johnny cracking one eye open, his face half buried in Carl's sweater. Carl let out a quiet groan. "Unbelievable." Johnny grinned sleepily. "You should really listen to me more." Amanda sighed, pressing a hand over her face. "Go to sleep." Johnny yawned dramatically. Fine. But this is officially the best Christmas ever. Carl glanced at Amanda, something soft lingering in his expression. Yeah, he murmured. It really is. Carl hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep on the couch. The fire had burned down to a soft glow, and a blanket had been draped over him at some point during the night. The stiffness in his shoulder reminded him that he'd slept in a position he wouldn't recommend to anyone, especially with a broken arm. But he didn't move just yet. For once, he wasn't in a rush. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Johnny. He was talking about syrup and pancakes and something involving a snowman, his voice full of energy that hadn't even begun to slow for the holiday. Amanda responded with a quiet hum, the clink of a spatula following her words. Carl sat up slowly, adjusting the blanket off his lap and wincing slightly as he flexed his fingers. His body ached, but his mind was calm in a way he couldn't remember feeling before. He glanced around the room, the twinkling lights on the tree still blinking lazily, and exhaled, letting the weight of the moment sink in. It was Christmas morning, and for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He wandered into the kitchen, following the smell of butter and batter and something sweet that might have been cinnamon. Amanda raised an eyebrow as he appeared, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look less like the guarded therapist he'd first met and more like the woman who had been slowly undoing him for months. You're supposed to be resting, she said without much force. I am, he replied, leaning against the counter. This is me, resting. Johnny glanced over from the table, where he was already covered in syrup. You have to try the pancakes. They're better than hospital food, right? By miles, Carl said. They sat down together a few minutes later, the three of them squeezed around Amanda's modest kitchen table, passing plates and pouring juice like they'd been doing it forever. Carl didn't say much, just watched, listened, and soaked it all in. The comfort. The noise. The quiet familiarity of people who had nothing to prove. When breakfast was over, Johnny insisted it was time for presents. He dragged them both into the living room and tossed himself onto the floor in front of the tree, dramatically pointing to the few wrapped boxes arranged underneath. Carl looked toward Amanda, unsure. Wasn't expecting to participate in this part. You showed up, she said, handing him a mug of hot chocolate. That's all it takes. He leaned back on the couch, watching Johnny tear into a package with the force of a much larger human. Wrapping paper flew, tape landed in his hair, and he let out a triumphant cheer at the sight of a small remote-controlled car. Amanda handed Carl a package wrapped in red and gold paper, smaller and flatter than the others. This one's from me, she said casually. He opened it slowly. Inside was a simple leather notebook, unlined, with a pen loop stitched into the spine. He ran his fingers over the cover and opened the first page. Her handwriting greeted him. Just in case you ever feel like telling your story. He glanced at her. She was already focused on helping Johnny with his next gift, not looking for a reaction. That felt like her, offering something meaningful and pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Before he could say anything, Johnny crawled over with a small box wrapped in snowflake paper. This one's from me. Carl accepted it with a nod. What is it? A business proposal? Better. He opened the box and found a folded piece of white paper inside, thick with colored marker. It was a card. On the front was a drawing of what looked like a house, 3 stick figures standing out front, one with curly hair, one with a cast on his arm, and one with what he assumed was a very stylish scarf. Above it, written in bold crayon, Merry Christmas, Carl. Inside, the message was short. I told you my plan would work. Carl laughed, shaking his head. You really don't give up, do you? Johnny beamed. Nope. He looked at Amanda again. She gave a small shrug, but there was warmth in her eyes that she wasn't hiding now. Something had shifted between them, something real. He could feel it. I don't know what your hourly rate is, Carl said, setting the card down. But your matchmaking skills might be worth investing in. Johnny puffed up proudly. I accept payment in pancakes and video games. Noted. The rest of the morning passed without fanfare. No rushed meetings, no phone calls, no urgent emails. Carl's phone remained untouched on the entry table. The idea of checking it didn't even cross his mind. He helped clean up the dishes, despite Amanda's half-hearted protests, and later, when Johnny insisted on showing off a Lego set he'd gotten from his grandparents, Carl joined him on the rug and let himself be bossed around about proper piece placement. By early afternoon, Johnny had fallen asleep again, sprawled across the couch with the blanket dragged up to his chin. Amanda was in the kitchen making tea, but when she returned, Carl was still sitting on the rug, the half-built Lego set in front of him, untouched. She sat beside him, tucking her knees up. "Long morning?" He shook his head. "Best one I've had in a long time." Amanda smiled, but it was quiet. "He's happy you're here." Carl looked over at Johnny, then back at her. "So am I." They didn't kiss again. There wasn't a grand speech or some official moment of declaration. There didn't need to be. Carl didn't think about next week or the next quarter or whether this thing between them came with conditions. All he thought about was how natural it felt to be sitting in this house, in a sweater he didn't own, with a cup of hot chocolate in one hand and a handmade card in the other. This, he realized, was what it felt like. To stop performing. To stop calculating. To love someone without needing it to look a certain way. And as the snow began to fall softly outside the window, covering the street in a fresh layer of quiet, he knew one thing with complete certainty: he never wanted to go back to the life he had before. The year that followed Carl's first Christmas with Amanda and Johnny changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He was still a billionaire CEO, still ruthless in board meetings, still the man who had built an empire from nothing. But work no longer consumed him the way it used to. The office lights didn't stay on as late. His inbox wasn't the first thing he checked in the morning. Business was still important, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. Instead, he found himself thinking about school pickup schedules, weekend plans that involved movie nights and soccer games, and whether Johnny had remembered to pack his lunch. He spent more time at Amanda's house than at his penthouse, and when he wasn't there, he missed it, the warmth of it, the way it felt lived in, the sound of Amanda humming to herself in the kitchen, Johnny's non-stop chatter about whatever new obsession had taken hold of his 7-year-old mind. It hadn't happened all at once. There was no grand moment of realization. It was gradual, steady, something that built over time. And before he knew it, they weren't just part of his life. They were his life. So, when their anniversary approached, Carl decided to do something big. Johnny had been begging for a beach vacation for months, ever since watching a documentary about sea turtles. Carl had shrugged and said, "Fine." But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. A trip. The three of them. Somewhere warm, somewhere away from everything. Somewhere perfect for what he had planned. The Bahamas turned out to be exactly what they needed. Sun-drenched days filled with lazy mornings by the water, Johnny gleefully splashing Carl every chance he got, Amanda stretched out in the sand, smirking as she watched Carl fail to pretend he wasn't having fun. Evenings spent exploring small shops, trying seafood at restaurants that overlooked the ocean, taking walks along the shore when Johnny inevitably fell asleep early from sheer exhaustion. Carl had planned to propose on their second night there. But then Johnny found a group of kids to build sandcastles with, and Amanda looked so relaxed as she curled up on a beach chair with a book, and Carl thought, what's the rush? Then the third night came and went. Then the fourth. And now, on their final evening, with the sky painted in deep shades of violet and gold, Carl realized he was actually nervous. He had faced boardroom battles, negotiated billion-dollar deals, built an empire from the ground up. But standing here, on this quiet stretch of beach, knowing what he was about to do, his pulse actually picked up. Amanda must have sensed something. She glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "You're acting weird." Carl forced a smirk. "Weird how?" She tapped a finger against her chin, mock thoughtful. "You're fidgety. And you keep checking your pocket like you think something's going to fall out." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe I just like having pockets. Amanda narrowed her eyes. Did Johnny put another crab in your shoes? Carl huffed a laugh, shaking his head. No. Not this time. She was still watching him, amusement flickering in her gaze, waiting for him to say whatever it was that had him so uncharacteristically unsettled. Carl inhaled deeply, letting the sound of the waves steady him. Then he reached into his pocket. Amanda's smile faltered slightly as she watched him pull out a small velvet box. Carl didn't open it right away. He held it in his palm, turning it over once before exhaling. You changed my life, Amanda. You and that little troublemaker of yours. Amanda's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Carl's voice was quieter now, more certain. I used to think love wasn't something I was meant to have. That some people just aren't built for it. He shook his head slightly. But then I met you. And Johnny. And everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, changed. He flicked the box open, revealing a stunning ring, simple but elegant, something he had picked out with Johnny's very opinionated help weeks ago. So, he said, holding it out to her, a rare softness in his expression. What do you say? Marry me? For a second, Amanda didn't move. Then she let out a slow breath and grinned. Took you long enough. Before Carl could respond, a blur of movement came from behind the nearby tree. Yes. Mom, say yes. I can't keep this secret any longer. Johnny burst out of his hiding spot, arms flailing in excitement, bouncing in place like he had been holding back a volcano of energy for weeks. Do it. Say yes. We had a whole plan. Amanda turned, half laughing, half exasperated. You knew? Johnny scoffed. Of course I knew. I helped pick the ring. And I told him what to say, but I think he forgot some of it. Carl let out a breath of laughter, shaking his head. You wanted me to include a joke about sea turtles. It would have been good, Johnny insisted. Amanda looked between them, eyes warm, then back down at the ring in Carl's hand. Her fingers curled around his, steady and sure. Yes. Carl slid the ring onto her finger before pulling her in, kissing her slow and certain, as Johnny cheered dramatically in the background. Later, as they sat by the bonfire, Johnny in the middle of an enthusiastic retelling of the entire proposal from his perspective, including the parts he helped with, Amanda leaned into Carl's side, her head resting against his shoulder. Carl glanced down at her, then at the ring on her finger. He still wasn't sure how he had ended up here, how the man who had spent years convinced he was better off alone had somehow become the kind of person who spent his evenings wrapped in warmth, in love, in a family that had grown around him without him even realizing it. But he wasn't going to question it. He was just going to hold on. The wedding was everything Amanda had dreamed of, intimate, warm, and filled with the people who mattered most. A lakeside villa, soft golden lights strung along the trees, the quiet ripple of water in the background as the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a glow that felt almost unreal. Johnny had insisted on being the ring bearer, a role he took with the utmost seriousness. When the moment came, he walked down the aisle at an excruciatingly slow pace, his chin lifted like royalty, making sure everyone admired the ring pillow he carried. The guests chuckled, but Amanda and Carl only exchanged a knowing look. He had been waiting for this moment almost as long as they had. And then it was her turn. Carl, usually composed, found himself gripping the edge of his cuff just to keep steady. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, of keeping his emotions locked away where they couldn't interfere with logic, or business, or the carefully constructed life he had built. But standing there, watching Amanda walk toward him in a dress that made his heart slam against his ribs, he felt completely undone. She was stunning, radiant in a way that made everything else fade to the background. He barely heard the music. Barely registered anything except the way she looked at him, like she had always known he would be here, like this was where he belonged. And suddenly, nothing in his past mattered. When she reached him, she let out a slow breath, eyes flickering over his face like she was committing this moment to memory. The officiant spoke, but Carl barely processed the words. It wasn't until Amanda's fingers tightened slightly around his that he realized it was time for the vows. Her voice trembled, just a little. You were the last person I expected to fall for, Carl Stevenson. But somehow, you found your way into my heart, and Johnny's. And now, I can't imagine life without you. Carl swallowed, trying to steady himself. He had spent weeks thinking about what to say, drafting and discarding words that didn't feel like enough. But now, standing in front of her, the only thing that felt right was the truth. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who deserved this. But you make me want to be better every single day. I love you, Amanda. And I love Johnny. You're my family. And I promise I will never take that for granted. Her eyes shimmered, her fingers tightening around his as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Carl barely waited for permission before pulling her in, capturing her mouth with his, ignoring the cheers and Johnny's exaggerated gagging noise. Later, as the sun set and the celebration carried on under the twinkling lights, Carl and Amanda swayed together on the dance floor, the laughter of friends and family drifting around them. Carl leaned in, murmuring, I never thanked Johnny properly for pushing us together. Amanda smirked against his shoulder. He's already making a list of things you owe him. Carl sighed. Of course he is. Before Amanda could respond, Johnny, still wearing his miniature tuxedo, now slightly wrinkled from an entire evening of running around, charged between them, wrapping his arms around both their waists in an uncoordinated hug. Best day ever, he declared. Carl let out a breath of laughter, resting a hand on Johnny's head. Yeah, it really was. Months later, Amanda and Carl found themselves in a familiar setting, a therapist's office. But this time, the couch wasn't in Amanda's clinic, and the session wasn't mandatory. Dr. Garcia, their new couples therapist, raised an eyebrow, glancing between them. So, what brings you two in today? Carl leaned back, smirking. Honestly? We just thought it'd be fun to see what therapy is like when I'm not complaining about my ex-wife. Amanda rolled her eyes but laughed. He insisted. He says it's our full circle moment. Dr. Garcia blinked, clearly unsure if they were joking. So, no issues to work through? Carl shrugged. Oh, plenty. But we figured we'd get ahead of them this time. He turned to Amanda with a slow smile. Besides, I like talking about my feelings now. Amanda snorted. That's debatable. Just then, the door burst open. Johnny leaned in dramatically. Are you guys done yet? We have movie night. Dr. Garcia's mouth opened slightly. Who is? Johnny grinned. I'm the reason they're married. Amanda sighed, getting up. Okay, that's enough matchmaker credit for one lifetime. As they left, Carl draped an arm around Amanda, pressing a kiss to her temple. Well, this was fun. Let's do it again in a year. Amanda shook her head but couldn't stop the smile that tugged at her lips. Somehow, against all odds, Carl Stevenson had gone from her most difficult patient to the love of her life. And that was the greatest transformation of all.